Hey, what's up? It's Derek Martin from CodeOpinion.com. I'm convinced if our industry finally acknowledges that how you develop code, how you deploy code, and how they're logically grouped together of what the functionality is, if we acknowledge that these are three different ideas, we can finally move forward instead of arguing over monoliths, microservices, and all the kind of these debates about what they are. Here is part three of my discussion with William Brander from Particular Software. I feel like stuff changes a little bit. It just changes it enough where it's kind of like different, and there is obviously progress, I think, that happens, but it also has a lot of like you can follow it online, like people, anything that something comes out that's new, it's like, well, that existed, you know what I mean, 8 years ago, and this has had the problems with it, and this will too. But I think it does. It's kind of like not learning from the past a little bit, but things do change a little bit. The time, like everything else kind of changes with it. That kind of makes it a little bit more appealing, or because of the pain that we just went through.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm really curious about, okay, this push to a modern modular monolith, like where is that going? Is it just a pure reaction based off of the super correction of one way and not understanding kind of the differences between a physical boundary and a logical boundary? Is that all we're really talking about? Like, is that really what happened? Is like, hey, they're not the same thing. So, and until we figure that out, we'll just keep going back and forth.
Oh, there are so few people talking about the difference between a physical and a logical boundary that I think you might be onto something. Um, Even when you I'm sure you've seen in the comments on your videos when you talk about the fact that just because you deploy something physically in two different places doesn't make it the same logical, or doesn't make it different logically. And if you take the same logical thing and split that physically into two separate locations, it doesn't make it two logically different things. I'm sure you've seen in some of your YouTube comments that people just get upset about that.
Because they've been a one-to-one
Yeah,
always. I don't know why that is. And maybe it's easier to reason about.
oh, it definitely is. Because then when you're drawing your architecture diagrams, you've got your one little square here, your one little square there, and the arrow between them, and it's great. You don't have to worry about the other 3+1 views, just
Yeah.
just the one.
Yeah, I often wonder if that's kind of where this stems from. There was a, I don't know if you read or knew much about Google Service Weaver that came out probably a year or so ago, maybe more than that,
No, I
if you're
don't.
familiar with it. So there was a paper that came out with it too. I'll have a link in the description so people can go read it. What I'm about to talk about here is that it was, what kind of threw me off is that the paper, um, right at the first paragraph, called out there being like the problem, some of the problems that are arising with microservices are not making the distinction between logical and physical. So
Okay.
when I was reading this, I was like, wow, like somebody's actually, because you said like it's not kind of really talked about enough. So I was like, wow, this is interesting. But then I continued reading it, and then what ultimately Service Weaver does is it really it's so it becomes, as you kind of in your development mode, you have to treat every, I don't know what they call them, modules, like calls between modules. You have to treat it as a network call. It forces you to treat it like a network call, even though if you deploy them together, it actually will turn it into a local call, like in memory.
Okay.
But you have to treat them physical. But I'm like, so I don't know how this helps anything.
Yeah, you
So you
you've
just,
still by having calling between different components, you still got that coupling between the different components. So
yeah,
regardless of whether you've made it a network call or a local call, the coupling is still there.
yeah. But it just forced you to deal with it, make it the assumption that it's a network call, like, because you have to deal with timeouts. It forces you down that road. It's like,
Mm.
okay, great that it's like forcing you to do the things maybe that you wouldn't necessarily do, and it made it transparent that it's a local call, but like you just still have that coupling that you can just willy nilly without much thought say, okay, I want to, I mean, have this module, and never mind where they're deployed, and I'm gonna have some coupling between them, whatever that is, and I don't know what it was solving. Like it's kind of, to me, the way I described it was kind of like a band-aid.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit like WCF and COM and DCOM.
That's what a lot of the comments were, I think.
Just,
But
we'll make it a code call, but it could be a remote call
yeah,
or it could be local. We'll find that at runtime.
I get. So, I mean, what do you think the reason is why there's not this distinction? Is it just because it's very hard to conceptualize like what a local, or sorry, what a logical boundary is when you're thinking about things as, um, well, like we said, it's just easier to reason about thinking, okay, I have this source code that I'm compiling or whatever the case may be, turning it into some deployable unit, right? Like it's the all be like that logical boundary is some development view, some repo or something that turns into some deployed artifact, and they're just all a one to one to one. And it's pretty easy to think about.
Yeah.
But if you start mixing and matching all of these, I think it's harder to think about them all in tandem or separately.
I think so from what I see with the people that I interact with, there's two ways that they can view the difference between logical and physical deployments. So the one is you've got one logical bit of code and you deploy it to 5 different places physically, but it's the same code that's deployed in all 5 different places. That people seem okay with because that's scaling out. It's just I've copied this
Sure,
code
yeah.
and stuck it somewhere else. What people don't seem to have as easy a time grasping is you've got one logical bit of code and one portion of that logical bit of code gets deployed in this assembly and another portion of this logical bit of code gets deployed in this assembly over here. And one bit of this logical code over here is controls whatever database it needs to. But now you've got two different bits of functionality deployed in two physically separate locations. It's still logically within that one service boundary because the coupling is internal to that boundary. The consistency is within that boundary, even though it is a remote call. Um, and that's sort of the logical to physical deployment mismatch that I think a lot of people struggle with, because it doesn't make sense to have a different bit of functionality from the same logical endpoint over here and over here. If the functionality is different, they must be logically different, right? And they are, but that's code logic, not service boundary logic.
Yeah.
Um, within a service boundary, if you've got a bit of code that's deployed physically over here, for instance, something that allows I don't know, a UI screen to query the orders from an order database somewhere. And then you've got a separate service that listens to a queue that picks up messages that allows you to place a new order. Those are still within the same bounded context of the orders. Oh, and I've just made the same mistake that we spoke about earlier, talking about entities instead of.
Yeah.
But we'll go with it for now. But logically, that's still within the same bounded context. Just because you've deployed different bits in different places in different ways doesn't mean that it's not. It's again, it's one of those things I think where when you see it work in a system where it's been implemented well, you wow, why are we doing this the other way around?
Yeah.
And to preempt it, there is still coupling in those examples, but the coupling is internal to the bounded context. So you can make whatever changes you want within the bounded context. As long as you control the deployment pipeline so that all of them are in sync, then it's fine.
Yeah, I often like the example I often use is if you're thinking about just even a mobile app, right? Like thinking about, okay, I have this kind of set of functionality. It ranges, say it's big enough of what it does. And then you have some interaction from the mobile app to say your API, some whatever the case may be, like everything that's on that, not everything, a portion of what's on that mobile app can belong, like is a logical boundary with the server side.
Yeah.
They're deployed in two different ways. They may live in two different repos. They may not, right? Like the are physically separate, built separately, maybe they're, like I said, maybe they're from the same group. It's just kind of this mix and match. I have a diagram that I made that I kind of split things up constantly to see all the kind of variations of what something might look like. I just think it's really hard to either want to go down the road of having to think that way about it, because I think it's just easy to say, okay, I have a repo that is a logical boundary that gets built and is deployed
Yeah,
independently. Never mind the scaling part of it, multiple instances, but it's just kind of that one to one to one. And I think that part of that for me has always been, I think that's been some of the trouble. But I'm curious of, okay, if you just take microservices out of it and you're saying now it's a modular monolith where that thing that was a microservice is now composed of other, and we're deploying that together. Um, I don't know whether I'm hesitant to say people would be in a better place. I mean, in some respects, maybe
hmm
because of the troubles of the distributed nature of what it was before. Like I love things like OpenTelemetry. I think they are awesome. I think they also could have been a band-aid for a problem people didn't need to have. You know what I mean? If I have an environment where I've shown examples of like, okay, I have a HTTP call come in, maybe it kicks off something to my database, then maybe I publish an event, and then that event gets picked up, and then I can see like this whole workflow because the asynchronous nature of it. It's awesome. It's great.
it is. Yeah,
But if I got service A makes an HTTP call to service B, and service B makes an HTTP call to service C, and then it makes a call somewhere else, and then that's because that's what I'm trying to see because I want to trace the whole thing. That's kind of a problem.
uh, I think I think some of the intents behind the modular monolith are uh, achieving um, some of the identification of internal coupling between components, because you have to build the whole thing together anyway, but you need to be able to pry the pieces apart. I just hope that we don't end up seeing the bad parts of most of the monoliths that we had 10, 15 years ago, where yes, all the code was great, but it all talks to one single database, or that you rely off of transactions to do absolutely everything. Because then as soon as you do that, it doesn't matter how modular you've made the rest of your components, you can't tear those apart. And then having something like OpenTelemetry into observability to see the flow of things when you tear those things apart isn't going to help you either, because to be able to tear them apart, you still need to break that internal coupling or the dependence on transactions that you've baked into your modularness.
So, what do you think? Where do you think we landed right now? Like, do you think that we're in a better place than when we started microservices? Overall, like where do you kind of feel, like what's your general feeling? Like I'm old man where I'm like, no, we didn't learn anything. And then other times I'm like, well, there are lessons that were, I think, that came through. I guess maybe it's too early to tell. But what's just your general feeling?
Okay, so I'm aging myself here, but SOA was fantastic until we got the the enterprise service bus and the compliance teams, and you had your teams that were dedicated to managing your daily power devices. You couldn't make changes to the message flows. Like SOA, the principles of SOA were great, and I think microservices might have been a too strong of a move in the other direction, because we didn't want the compliance teams. We wanted just to be able to have these small independent things that we could change and deploy. And that might have been going too far. The modular monolith part is, I think, I don't want to say an overcorrection, but there's definitely a shift back to cohesion, more cohesion, which is going to make some things easier. Um, I, I hope that as an industry we start spending more time thinking about the coupling that we introduce in between the components. I think if you can get that right, a lot of the problems with all of the technology or design type choices that we've been discussing would be lessened. If we had the coupling right with microservices, the coupling and the cohesion, as you said, the balance between the two right with microservices, wouldn't have these horrible screenshots of, it was at Netflix or Uber where they had like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of microservices deployed. In fact, there's a customer that I've got where they when they deploy an endpoint, it becomes immutable. It's there forever. Like they never decommission, they never change that endpoint. It's out in the world, and that's it. When I first saw that, my reaction was, "Wow, that's really cool, but why?"
Yeah.
So I think what I'm hoping is that we're sort of like circling around, getting closer and closer to something that's a bit better.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. That's kind of what I've been hoping, is kind of narrowing in a little bit, and
Hope
through
so.
kind of the iterations of this, it'll end up in a better place.
Yeah. We do seem to come up with the most complicated ways to send little angle brackets down to the browser
I know, right?
to render JavaScript.
I want to thank William from Particular Software for having this conversation. That was pretty insightful. If you enjoyed this style of video where I have a guest on, have a more of a kind of casual conversation like this, let me know in the comments. And if you want to get in on conversation about software architecture and design, you can join my channel and get access to a private Discord server where you can interact with other software developers about topics like this. Check the link in the description on how to join. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, make sure to leave a comment, and please subscribe for more videos on software architecture and design. Thanks.